I'm a self-taught filmmaker. I never went to film school. I never studied filmmaking in any way. I started making films when I was a kid, when I was, I think, 7 years old. Making films using my dad's Super 8 camera and little action figures, doing stop motion films, a little bit of animation and a certain amount of live action. And I just carried on making films as I grew up. And over the years they got bigger, hopefully better, but more elaborate. And there never really was a period in my life where I completely stopped doing that. So I was always moving up, eventually from Super 8 to 16mm films. And then I think what Following represents is kind of the peak of what I was able to do on my own or just with friends, just using our own resources and borrowing equipment and sort of using the things around us to make a film. While I was a student running the College Film Society along with Emma Thomas, my wife and producer, we tried to make various different films, and some of them quite ambitious, you know, shot in color and so forth, and, you know, tried to do quite long form stuff. And the problems you would encounter, the things that stopped the film being something that you could really put in front of an audience, really technically finish or creatively create something that an audience could really go with and not be alienated by the low budget qualities of it. We learned a lot in doing those things that we were eventually able to try experimenting with short films where you stripped it down and you said, okay, if we shoot black and white film stock so that we can get a bit of an expressionist style cheaply and quickly, if we do it predominantly handheld camera, so we're not trying to ape larger movie-making techniques with the dolly and so forth and things that actually require very expensive equipment, can you create a very stripped-down, very tight production machine that would then be applied to making a feature film, where you sort of learned, in a sense, how to make a short film in a weekend, like Doodle Bug or Larceny, these short films we worked on. You'd shoot it in a weekend, and then you'd edit it and whatever and put it together. When we came to do Following, we were sort of shooting a short film every weekend. So it would be a 2-minute, 3-minute chunk of the film done every weekend, and that was the approach we took. When we were making Following, I was working in the field of corporate videos. I was doing camera work and sound work for media training sessions for companies and recording radio programs in a studio, that kind of thing. And I actually learned a lot doing that kind of video camera work. I learned a lot about going into an environment, using a couple of lights, setting up very fast, and then having to do something to a very rigorous schedule, because you'd be interviewing, you know, the chairman of some huge corporation, and he'd come in for 10 minutes and expect you to just run and then walk out, just like I've walked in here today. It's exactly the same thing. And you'd figure out how to do something that looked pretty good very quickly. And that was very much the production methodology we transferred over to the film we were making. So I would take a basic lighting kit with, you know, 3 redheads. On a big day, we'd have a blonde, you know, in a case, whatever. And we'd come up and we'd light the whole set with, you know, 3 or 4 lights, and do it very quickly, and adopt a sort of documentary style. We'd look at the natural lighting, the situation we were in, and then you'd try and just enhance that or exaggerate that to the degree you needed to get the correct exposure as the actors move around the room. But if you look at Following with a mind to this, you'll see that everybody basically stands by the windows the whole time. Funnily enough, with the director of photography I've worked with ever since, Wally Pfister, on our biggest films, we basically adopt the same approach with a lot more toys, a lot more technology, but it really is a question of trying to create a sort of heightened naturalism. And that efficiency was something I learned in the work I was doing during the week. But also it was a major part of choosing to shoot the film in black and white, because I knew that the speed with which we were going to have to work, the conditions under which, you know, we were going to have to film a scene, to try and do that with color lighting and color photography, it would be very, very difficult to get anything acceptable looking, anything with any feeling of style. The nice thing about black and white is you eliminate one massive set of variables in terms of balancing your lights with the natural daylight that's around and so forth. And so you're able to, just with a couple of lights, throw up some, you know, interesting lighting, get something that has a certain style to it. When I went into making bigger films, I had to hire a director of photography for the first time. You know, for me, that was a source of a great deal of concern because all of my filmmaking to that point had been me with the camera, directing through the lens in a way. The film was shot always single camera. We used two different types of camera. We used an Arri BL 16mm. We used a Bolex Clockwork, you know, wind-up camera for the street stuff. I really only shoot single camera. I always have. When you do big action movies, you have to use multi-camera sometimes for stunts and things like that. But everything else, we've only ever used one camera, and that's always felt the right way to approach storytelling to me, is knowing the shot that's going to be on screen at any one moment, and then taking the camera and putting it onto the shot that's going to be the next shot, you know. And interestingly, I think that learning camera blocking through the lens is a three-dimensional process, because you're not looking at a monitor. You're looking through the reflex viewfinder of the camera, and you're actually gauging your physical position to the actors, and you're changing things and trying to hide things or reveal certain things in the lighting or whatever by the way in which you move your body, because following was almost entirely handheld, and that was where I enjoyed working. It was kind of camera work I really enjoyed. So I think there was an interesting similarity really between learning how to block a scene and how to place the camera with it on your shoulder and using your body to actually move the camera around, and then not using a monitor, as I don't on subsequent films. I don't use a monitor. I look at everything to eye, and I place the camera with the DP, you know, according to where it sits in relation to the actors. And I think that for people, even people using a modern, you know, camcorder that has a monitor on the camera, it's a completely different thing. You're looking at a two-dimensional image, and you're not thinking about your physical relationship with the performers, and it changes the storytelling. The zoom lens, you know, don't use zoom lenses. And if you don't use zoom lenses, then you are having to physically move the camera closer or further away to what you're photographing, depending on the point of view that you're trying to achieve, or the perspective you're trying to give the audience on it. And I think I learned a lot of that on following, even though we did actually have a zoom lens. We had an Angenieux, I think, on the camera. But we tended not to use it much. We tended to actually move around more. And actually, quite a lot of it was done on Bolex with prime lenses as well, the walking along the street scenes and things. So you're, in whatever way we tend to be photographing these scenes, you tended to be very mindful of where you were in physical relationship with the performers. Also because we weren't building sets, we were just in real places, and so we couldn't alter things for the camera. We could only move the camera through the scene to find what we wanted in that way. And that's a discipline I've tried to maintain on larger films. And so I won't fly walls and ceilings and things on sets. Even if you can drill a hole in the set, I won't. I'll keep the camera inside that physical space, because I think that it's very important to maintain the appropriate physical relationship between camera and performer that you need for the perspective of the storytelling. There were several limitations that you put on that we hadn't adhered to in earlier short films. So things like shooting in black and white was embraced as a limitation. It's like, okay, we just can't, even if we wanted to tell the story in color, which, you know, I wouldn't have actually. But even when I was conceiving what the story for following would be, I was thinking about a black and white film. I was thinking about a film that would all be handheld. And one of the things we did at the beginning of following, the first scene with dialogue in the film, is shot on the dolly. We had this enormous dolly in the Film Society. We shot the police station scene in the Film Society because we couldn't move it, or you couldn't move it out of there. It was a studio based, essentially, with this track. But I wanted to have the first scene be a very controlled, competently made, you know, piece of filmmaking, so that when you see the rest of the film is all, you know, a Bolex, not even on the shoulder, because you can't put it on the shoulder, but bouncing around and walking around the streets and following people and all of that, that it would be clear that that was deliberate, that it would be framed and put in a context where you realize that it wasn't accidental, it was a choice. And those choices could be seen as limitations, but we looked at them. I sort of sat down and thought, okay, what are they going to be? and then wrote the script with those in mind very much. And some of them were more esoteric. I mean, I just happened to notice that with no budget films, guns don't work very well, you know, because you can never get the right replica gun. It's never got the weight to it. You can't fire blanks with it, you can't, you know, and so whenever you'd see that in somebody's student film or whatever, it would always seem to give the budget away or seem a bit, you know, whatever. So we used, you know, a hammer instead of a gun because we could do a hammer cheaply and make a rubber hammer that we could, you know, smash the guy's fingers with or whatever. So there are things like that where we tried to identify what are the things that really betray the budget to the audience, what take them out of the film and stop them being able to engage with the film as a story the whole way through. Because all filmmaking, I think, is a balance between technical expertise, the technical expectations of the audience, and then the storytelling. I think that getting a strong technical grounding was very important for me, and learning how to photograph things on film, expose the film correctly, choose the film stocks, those kind of things, has served me extremely well as I've gone on to bigger and bigger films, and frankly had more and more a bewildering array of technical options, things you can buy and so forth, and massive pressure from, frankly, electronics companies and engineering firms and labs and however people are trying to push you. You're given endless misinformation, and you as a filmmaker, you literally watch that become currency. When I first came to Hollywood and made Memento, at the time everyone was pushing Super 35 as a medium over anamorphic, and when you knew the reality of it and the science of it and the physics of it, it's a vastly inferior format, and there was no reason to do it. And even though Memento was a very small film, we shot it anamorphic, and you know, we used the full area of the 35mm negative. And, I had to know that myself, so that when I interviewed DPs, and I would ask them, you know, would you shoot at Super 35, would you shoot at anamorphic? Their answer would tell me a lot about how much they knew technically and so forth. You really have to know this stuff yourself, and it applies very much to editing as well. And I think I'm very fortunate that I was one of the last generation, I suppose, to be able to cut on film. We cut following on tape. I used 2 U-matic machines and did it tape to tape, because the film I had tried to finish before then, and with some of the short films, I'd realized that cutting on film, it's very difficult to then raise the money to cut your negative, print it, and so forth. What we did in the case of following is we edited on video using U-matic tape, and then did a final cut with my editor, Gareth Heel. He came along and did a final set of trims and things on the Avid, and we were able to use that to do a rough sound mix and make our 16mm track from that. Then when we got into our first festival, we were able to go to people and say, look, could you help us out getting a print made and pay for a negative cut and a 16mm print and an optical track and so forth. So I've always looked for the most expedient technology, the technology that can get you to where you need to go, but always try to hold on to what's going to be the best quality for the film, what's going to have the richest feel to it.
Something else you'd like to tell me? Anything?
I think in terms of protecting myself editorially, the thing that I started to develop on following, that I've carried on ever since, that has most served me, is probably cross-cutting. So I'll always try and intercut scenes if possible, because if you know that you're cutting the scene with these 2 people in here, with the scene with the guy running down the street here, you know that if you've got a gap anywhere, if there's something that didn't work, if there's something that wasn't covered, you've got a very invisible way of getting around that. And so I enjoy the editing rhythm, and it you know, it's something I wouldn't be doing it just for that reason, but I found that to be a great asset, as opposed to shooting very conventional coverage where you know you have to cover, you know, everything in exactly a precise way. In the case of following, we would do, you know, the 2-shot in a scene. We would only shoot the 2 lines that we were going to use in the film, so we wouldn't run the whole scene that way. You know, if you look at Cobb and Bill, you know, in the cafe at the beginning when they're talking, we cut out to the 2-shot where he puts the bag on the table and unzips it. We just shot those couple of lines In fact, I think pretty sure the first 2 lines of the scene, that action with the bag, and then the last couple lines, thinking it might pop out at the end as well. Things like that. But I think that kind of discipline's just been, it's a very efficient, very useful discipline for a director to have to go through that process of really deciding, really cutting in your head as you shoot. I think it's a valuable thing to be able to do, particularly when you get into a tight squeeze at the end of a day, or lights going or whatever, and you really have to suddenly decide. You're not going to be able to cover everything in all the different ways that you'd hoped. You're going to have to decide then and there what's the most important thing. The use of inserts in the film is quite noticeable. It's something I've maintained in all my films. There's a couple different reasons for it. There is a form of narrative connection that's made through objects in the film and drawing attention to the objects. Things like the hammer, some of the connections between scenes as they appear in the film are based purely on those objects, you know, the earring or the hammer or the seahorse or these things, rather than time. And so it became a way of visually linking things. We also did it for technical reasons, because one of the things you can do with very little money and very little time is you can shoot a really beautiful insert very, very quickly. You can soft light it from the side, you can throw up the lens, you can get something that looks really, really nice and helps ground a scene with some visual quality, with some visual character. And it's something actually I talked to Wally a lot about in Memento. And Memento, for narrative reasons, is full of inserts, but it's also, you know, when you're up against it in terms of trying to give a style to a film, it's a lovely way to really be able to give the audience some feeling of the texture of the world. That's harder to get in the wide shots when you don't have, you know, time and money and limitless sort of, you know, production value.
Shit, we shouldn't have come up here. We're gonna have to wait ages to get down again. Here's the way up here.
I think, you know, the sound really is the hardest thing for a no-budget film, you know, to really try and, you know, compete with the type of filmmaking and entertainment that people are used to, because they're used to watching very polished presentations. And so we did a couple of things on following. One of the things I did, and I was explaining this to our sound mixer the other day, and I think he was a little taken aback that we'd done it on purpose, but one of the things I figured out is if we start the film in voiceover, and if we started with the first scene in a very controlled environment with 2 people just talking where we knew we could get good sound, you could begin the film in such a way that people weren't immediately alienated by the quality of the sound. And so you could get 3-4 minutes into the film before you hit them with this terrible, you know, camera noise, cars going by, you know, whatever. And it actually worked pretty well. You know, you would go to festivals with the film and the film would start and it would sound pretty good for the first couple of minutes. And then by the time people realize, you know, just how cheap this film is and how bad it sounds, they're already into the story. We had a variety of sound recorders on the film. It would change week to week, but all of them did very well. I mean, mostly it was our friend Ivan Cornell. We used my friend David Lloyd's DAT recorder. It was the beginning of the sort of era where you could buy a small DAT recorder fairly cheaply, and that was a, you know, semi-professional format. We had a great Sennheiser 416 microphone down at the Film Society that, you know, it's a shotgun mic. It's not really the kind of thing people use for recording dialogue that much, although, frankly, I think they should, because it isolates the voice quite nicely. And it just has a nice sound to it. And so we also got Dave Julian to do a couple of days, who actually did the music for the film. He did some of the sound recording as well. But we also did a few cheap tricks that I've used ever since, like doing dry takes, you know, where you don't roll the camera after you've shot the scene. If you've got terrible, you know, airplane noise overhead, you just run the scene right away as a dry take without running the camera. And I mean, interestingly for me, on The Dark Knight, when we were shooting with IMAX cameras where you couldn't get any usable sound, we did exactly that. We did that with Christian Bale and Heath Ledger. We got the sound for all of their scenes by doing that exactly the same technique. And to me, it was interesting that something you learned, you know, on a tiny film was absolutely essential to this enormous film that we then did. I'd always liked film noir and crime fiction as a way of extrapolating your own life, your own neurosis or whatever, and making it accessible and making it something that people could care about. And I really gravitated towards that genre, and still do, frankly, but very much at the time. I felt very young and very inexperienced, and I felt that my own life and the things I saw in the world were not going to be of interest to people. But they felt interesting to me, and so I was looking for a language, I was looking for a genre in which I could take things that I was interested in and make them accessible, make them interesting to other people. And I think that the crime genre, the film noir genre, I think that's the way it works. It's characters are defined through action, double cross, things they're doing to each other, your particular fears about whatever it is, your life, your relationships, whatever those things are. The best film noir has always been very firmly founded on those relatable fears, taken into the realm of, I mean, I suppose you could call it melodrama or heightened reality or whatever that is. And I felt, as a young filmmaker starting out and trying to do something with very little resources, I felt much more comfortable working in the area of sort of heightened reality that a crime story, that a film noir gives you, and with the black and white and everything. You could push the naturalism of things as far as you could, but the subject matter and the way the story was put together was always within the realm of heightened reality, of a slightly timeless feel we wanted to have to the design of the thing and the way it looked and felt. It actually, working in that genre, and it's certainly something you see Mamet's work and various other people, but when you're working within that genre, it actually buys you quite a lot of creative freedom to experiment narratively, because you begin the film with a voiceover, you set up a guy in a police station talking to a cop, you know, whatever. The audience knows that you're going to get back to that. They know that they're going to get answers to certain questions. And so you're then able to take quite a few leaps, I think, in terms of comprehensibility or clarity for the audience. You're really able to experiment a bit in between those mileposts of the genre. I think when we made Following, it was coming right at a time when no budget films were being made in America, and doing it in London was very different. Nobody was doing anything like that. But you could go to a movie theater and go and see Clerks or go and see El Mariachi and see that it was indeed possible to do something on that scale and have it distributed, have it be a real film. And I think we were actually in the process of shooting Following when those films came along, and they were extremely inspiring, because you could talk to the cast and crew, the people you were working with, and sort of say, okay, well, you know, it's possible that if you make a film, it can get distribution, it can go someplace. At the same time, we always felt, and I've always felt very strongly, that every film you do, you can't ever view it as a stepping stone to making another film. You have to really enjoy the film for what it is and just do that. But at the time, it was really unheard of in England to do a no-budget film as such. And indeed, in England, there wasn't really much of a festival circuit to get your work out on. And what we wound up doing with Following was shooting it, doing everything, you know, finishing it completely in England. And then we moved to America and got the film distributed by getting it out there on the American Film Festival circuit. It wasn't conscious on my part to have another script sort of ready to go by the time we went to, you know, film festivals with Following. While we were finishing up the cut on it and doing very long, slow technical finishing, which when you have no money takes forever because you're sort of waiting for the lab to have a, you know, run the 16mm bath, you know, whatever it is. In that time, I was putting together the script for Memento, and so also in the time it took to get Following noticed on the festival circuit and sort of get out there, I had actually finished the script. And in retrospect, it was a massive advantage, because I was able to say, okay, you like that film, this is what I want to do next. Because in your best case scenario of what can happen to you with putting a film out there and getting distribution, for example, you'll then ask the question, okay, well, what do you want to do next? And if you have an answer, you can use that very short window of interest that you get from people in what you've done. But I will say that I think that was purely an accident. And I think that if you were to try and plan to, write another script while you're finishing a film, you really risk taking your focus off the project that you're doing. And I think that it's most important to just throw yourself into just putting everything into the project you're working on, and that's something I've always done since. If you can, then because quite often there is a period between finishing a project and actually people seeing it or actually people responding to it. If you can try and, instead of going on holiday for 6 months, use that period to try and figure out what you would do next if somebody gave you the opportunity, then you're going to give yourself a huge advantage.